of interesting seeing YouTubers and Twitter shills kind of going full mask off when it comes to discussing the Nintendo Switcheroo, the upcoming piece of Nintendo hardware that's definitely going to come out at some point in the future. Like, notice that I'm not saying this year. Notice that I'm not saying anything concrete about the console. So we really don't know, okay? Everything that's floating around right now is complete speculation and should be considered as such. However, the vast majority of the community is doing this thing where they're trying to pretend as if these rumors are confirmed, that this is hard information, that we know this about the console and its games, and it's just none of it is true. And I've been very, very vocally opposed to this kind of discussion online because to me it just seems as if this is a very clear attempt by the community to kind of confuse what the Nintendo Switcheroo actually is. Right? When you actually look at what people are saying online, when you see like their narrative, like it's always very, very obvious what they're trying to do. They're always trying to spin the Switcheroo, in a bad light. Every single time it's always just like, oh, it's not as powerful as a PS4 Pro, and it's gonna struggle to compete with these handheld PCs, Nintendo won't be able to replicate their success because the Switch was so successful, and people won't be looking to upgrade. Like, they're coping so hard that it's becoming very, very clear that they don't necessarily know that their bias is becoming more and more apparent, especially when it comes to like these Twitter insiders, people like Genki GPN, JPN, people like Benji Sales, Imran Khan recently came out with that Punch-Out story that was debunked almost immediately, but people pretended it was real anyway. The thing about these guys is that their job, much like Michael Pachter's a decade ago, is to create this narrative, the illusion that Nintendo is losing its market control to Sony, right? This is their real purpose. Okay, they're not actually invested in like how well video game consoles sell and what's popular and what's not. Like they're not like hardcore industry enthusiasts. They are they are attempting to influence investor decisions. They are attempting to subvert the gaming community to get people to believe that the PlayStation 5 is way more relevant than it actually is, right? Every single time they release these easily debunkable statements, like the recent claim that Mario and Luigi Brothership bombed, which clearly isn't true. Like, every single time Nintendo releases a new big relevant thing, they're there day one to try and make it out to like not be a big deal and not that all impressive. And then the same people come out and try to worship Sony properties that come out. Like the big one recently was Astro Bot, right? We know now that it sold like 1.5 million units, which isn't bad or anything, but like when you really look at like what people were saying day one, right? When you look and see when people were saying that like Astrobot was better than like the entire history of Mario and it outsold like like every major 3D platformer, like it was obviously like it was easily debunked, right? If you know anything about how much like 3D platformers actually sell. But the narrative, like for the first couple of weeks, was that like Astrobot was this like huge phenomenal thing, right? That it was this bestseller, that it was like this huge deal on PlayStation, and it just wasn't, right? If you actually look at the numbers, if you look at how quickly Astrobot fell off, like it was an AstroTurfing thing. They specifically ignored Mario Odyssey. They ignored like Kirby and the Forgotten Land. They ignored all these really good 3D platformers in order to prop up the PlayStation thing. And this is a reoccurring problem with the entire community, in that we have to deal with these people coming out and making these ludicrous statements against Nintendo and on behalf of their competitors. Like, just look at how salty someone like Logan Plant gets when people call him out on his like poor Mario and Luigi Brothership score. Like, we all know what happened. We all know that IGN was deliberately trying to undermine the game. They were doing everything in their power. But like, it didn't work, right? Like again, more and more people like every time these personalities become known, every time they start becoming memes, they start losing their credibility. Yeah, again, I really want to reflect back on what happened with Michael Pachter, back in the early 10s. I believe he's still around, by the way, but like back in the day, like he was telling us that Nintendo was gonna fail during the Wii era and go third party. He was one of the big advocates for this idea that Nintendo was definitely going to go third party, that the Wii was just a fad, and it was because of his actions that we had to sit there instead of talking about actual Nintendo products, explaining to normies that no, Nintendo isn't going bankrupt, they're not going third party, no, they are extremely competitive. It's like again, because of people like Pachter, people had this misinterpretation that Nintendo was like on the verge of bankruptcy. And now they're trying to do it again with the Switcheroo. And they are going to do it again in the early years of the console as well. This is the big thing that I've been saying since we started talking about this thing. But the instant Nintendo actually gives a hard reveal for the Switcheroo, you are going to see a lot of people come out like, oh man, I was so excited for the Switcheroo and now I'm disappointed. Oh, I've been a hardcore Nintendo fan since the NES and now I'm abandoning the company for Sony. You're gonna be seeing a lot of that in the post reveal and probably like a lot after launch, right? Like it's the same thing that's happening now. I do think this is why people are right to push back against the Brothership review and stuff like that, because you just know that everything that isn't the big AAA release on the Switcheroo is going to get heavily, heavily scrutinized and shit on. ARMS was a really good example on Switch. The original Octopath Traveler is a good example. Like, it's true that those games are classics now, but back then they were considered like these really disappointing releases. All right, Nintendo put Acquire on Mario and Luigi Brothership because of how well Octopath did. Like, how that can't be understated, like how big of a success Octopath was. And yet at the time, it was considered a failure, right? Like, again, at the time, ARMS was considered a failure, right? The Switch, there was a time where people thought that Horizon Zero Dawn was a better game than Breath of the Wild, right? And that's insane looking back on it now, considering just how big the Switch has become and like how none of these PlayStation games have stayed relevant. But this is what happens every single time. And I'm really curious if Nintendo is going to be able to break the cycle with the Switcheroo. Because to me, this is the big make it or break it moment. Not because of Nintendo as a brand. They've pretty much already succeeded. The issue is, if they manage to follow up on the Switch with an even bigger success, there will be no more copes. Okay, people will not be able to to point to Nintendo's history and try and say that the console is doomed to fail or anything like that. They won't be able to downplay the games. They won't be able to downplay the hardware. Right? There's gonna be this growing inability to downplay the success of Nintendo hardware. And I do think that's been the trend lately, is this idea that Nintendo's hardware is inferior, but they only stay competitive because of their better games. And I just don't think that's true. It isn't true. Just the Nintendo hardware is just better than the competition. And yet we just see the community just consistently refuse to admit it because it goes against everything they've been told by game journals about how the industry works. The idea that PlayStation and Xbox being such cutting edge hardware, that is what led to all these great third-party games coming to the console, when in reality Sony and Microsoft were just paying for all this support and keeping these third parties on life support for decades. There's a reason all these companies are struggling now, Capcom, Square, Ubisoft. It's because they aren't getting returns from their investment on PlayStation and Xbox. That business model that was celebrated back in the mid-2000s has been a complete and total failure. And nobody wants to admit it. Nintendo has won the console war, and yet we're still seeing people like insist it isn't true. You're seeing people like insist that like the PlayStation 3 was a success story. Like it's just like, what are you delusional? Like, oh, the PlayStation Vita was such a great console. Like, PlayStation doesn't produce handhelds anymore because the Vita was such a failure. Like to me, I definitely want to see the switcheroo before I start making like statements about like how bad Nintendo has won the console war, because the Wii U beat the PS4 as well because it just sold more games and all those games became more successful on the Switch, which is another example about how like console generations don't really mean anything in this day and age. But um it's going to be really interesting when the switcheroo finally gets revealed and we see just how boned PlayStation and Xbox actually are, because I think like going forward, if this console is a success, it's going to be very, very difficult to continue to downplay Nintendo hardware.